right, let's jump into another deep dive. This time we're looking at sales strategies, but from a different angle.
Oh,
We're going to be dissecting basically an English training podcast,
interesting.
but it uses, get this, a business meeting scenario
Okay.
to teach vocabulary and expressions.
I like it. Kind of a double deep dive.
Exactly. Exactly. It's meta, right?
Hmm.
We're learning about sales, but also how language learning works, in the real world.
Yeah, that's a really clever approach. I mean, you get to see how they break down these concepts.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they actually start right off the bat with this vocabulary preview section. So before the dialogue even starts, they highlight two terms:
Okay.
drive sales and promotion.
Oh, that's smart. That's good teaching.
Right.
It's like setting the stage, giving you a framework before you even dive into the content.
It's priming you for what's important.
Exactly. It's like schema building, in education. You give people the key terms up front, helps them absorb everything better.
Yeah, totally. So, okay, let's get into this dialogue. We're in a sales meeting, right? And the boss, Clark, he's stressed.
Oh, I bet.
Sales are down, and he's putting the pressure on his team. They've got to come up with solutions.
Classic high-pressure sales environment. I can just imagine it.
Oh, yeah, you can feel the tension, even just listening to the audio.
Yeah.
And then you hear it, especially in Roger's voice. He kind of hesitantly suggests, maybe we should lower prices to match the competitors.
Yeah, that's usually the first thing people jump to, but it can be a slippery slope. You start a race to the bottom, and not every business can survive that.
Exactly. And then Natalie jumps in. She suggests a promotion,
Okay.
which,
Yep.
remember, was one of our prepped vocab words. But here's the thing. The boss, he just shoots it down immediately.
Right.
Bad idea, he says.
Oh, so it's not the idea itself, it's who's suggesting it.
Yes.
Yes.
And that happens all the time, right? In any workplace. Same suggestion, different person, totally different reaction.
Oh, absolutely. I've seen that play out so many times. It's almost comical how predictable it is.
And then, wait for it, a few minutes later, the CEO walks in
Uh-huh.
and suggests the exact same thing. A promotion.
No way!
And of course, suddenly everyone thinks it's brilliant.
Oh, the power of authority. Isn't that fascinating? It's like our brains are wired to be influenced by someone's status.
Totally. Makes you wonder how many good ideas get tossed aside
Yeah.
because they didn't come from the right person.
Right. That's a good point. It really makes you think about how we evaluate ideas and if it's always about merit or if there's more to it.
So anyway, the podcast then has this language takeaway section. They unpack some key phrases from the dialogue. So first up is match the competitors,
Mhm.
which they explain as, like offering the lowest price guarantee, things like that.
Right, so it's not just knowing the words, but knowing how they're used in a business context.
Yeah. And then they have in the market, which means like within a specific industry, right?
Wow.
So they give examples like English Pod is the best language podcast in the market. Or iPods were once the most popular MP3 players in the market.
So you're positioning something within a specific landscape.
Exactly. Then lastly, they've got it'll never fly, basically, meaning an idea won't work. And their example is, what, you want to sell bikinis in Alaska? That'll never fly.
So that's funny. Yeah, it's a way to be skeptical, but also kind of informal.
Yeah. Oh. Okay, so that's the language takeaway. Done. Now they move on to this fluency builder section, and here they're focusing on how things are said, not just the meaning. For instance, instead of I'll be there soon, they use I'll be there any minute.
Oh, I see. So it's more immediate.
Right.
Yeah.
It's more casual, more like, how you'd talk to a friend.
Yeah, like texting versus sending an email. It's a different register of language.
Exactly. And then they point out how they use consider instead of think about, which sounds, more formal, more professional.
Make it sound like you've really weighed the options.
Right. Like you're choosing the right tool for the job.
I like that analogy.
And then, of course, we have brilliant, which the CEO uses to describe, Natalie's idea once he suggests it.
Ah, yes, full circle.
Right. And interesting, brilliant is more British sounding. Right?
Yeah.
More enthusiastic than just saying great.
Yeah, and it just goes to show how even subtle word choices can be influenced by our background and how they can affect how people perceive us.
So it makes you wonder, even with simple words, how much is culture playing a role?
Oh, absolutely. And that actually segues perfectly into the whole topic of cross-cultural communication. But we'll dive into that in part 2.
I'm looking forward to that. But before we jump ahead too far, I want to go back to the boss, Clark, for a second.
Okay.
He's clearly not the, most motivating manager.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what do you think that kind of leadership, that fear-based approach, does to a team's ability to come up with good sales strategies? I mean, does it help or hurt her?
That's a fantastic question, and one I think a lot of people can relate to. We should definitely explore that more.
Yeah, that's a great question to pick up on. I mean, think about it, right? If you've got a manager who's constantly breathing down your neck,
Right.
creating this atmosphere of fear, it's got to impact your ability to think creatively, to take risks.
Totally. You're so worried about messing up, about saying the wrong thing. You're not going to be like brainstorming bold new ideas.
Exactly. And
So,
it's interesting, if you go back to that dialogue, even when Roger suggested the match the competitors strategy,
yeah.
remember how hesitant he
Oh,
sounded?
yeah. He was almost apologetic.
Like he was bracing for a negative reaction.
It was painful to listen to.
It totally was. And that's the thing, that kind of environment, it just shuts down creativity. Instead of brainstorming, everyone's just trying to avoid making a mistake.
It's like that old saying, right? The nail that sticks out gets hammered down.
Exactly. And in that kind of atmosphere, you're not going to get any innovation. No one's going to try anything new. So what's the antidote then? What does a good manager do to actually encourage people to come up with those, brilliant ideas?
Well, first of all, they create a space where it's safe to take risks,
Okay.
where people feel comfortable sharing their thoughts, even if they're not fully formed, even if they're a little out there.
So it's not about shutting down ideas. It's about being open to them.
Exactly. A good manager, they ask questions, they listen, they give constructive feedback.
That create that psychological safety, right? Where you don't feel like you're going to be judged or ridiculed for speaking up.
Exactly. And it's interesting. We can actually tie this back to language learning.
Oh,
How so?
think about it. When you're learning a new language, you need a safe space to make mistakes, to
Mhm.
experiment, to try things out without feeling embarrassed.
So you're saying it's the same for a team trying to come up with new sales strategies.
Exactly. You can't expect people to be creative if they're constantly worried about saying the wrong thing.
It's like you have to give them permission to fail. In a way, yes, because often those failures lead to the most innovative solutions.
It's like that Edison quote, right? I haven't failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work.
Exactly. And even in the English training podcast, they talked about that phrase, it'll never fly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
sure, sometimes it's a way of expressing skepticism,
Yeah.
but it doesn't have to be a final judgment. Right. It can be a starting point for a conversation.
Like, okay, so maybe this idea won't work exactly as it is, but what can we learn from it? How can we adapt it, refine it?
Exactly. It's about shifting the focus from judgment to exploration.
And that brings us back to language, I think.
Oh, how so?
Well, we've been talking about specific phrases, vocabulary.
Right.
But language itself, it's a tool.
It is.
And like any tool, you can use it to build something up or to tear something down.
That's a powerful way to put it.
And, it makes me think about what you said earlier about cross-cultural communication.
Hmm.
If even a simple word like brilliant can have different connotations,
Yay.
depending on where you're from, your background,
Oh, absolutely.
then imagine how much more complex it gets when you're talking about, business strategies, marketing plans.
It's a minefield, and I think that's what makes it so fascinating.
It is. But also kind of daunting, right? Like, how do you navigate all those nuances?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, and one we'll try to unpack as we continue our deep dive. But first, I think it's important to step back for a moment
Yeah.
and recognize just how much our own cultural backgrounds shape the way we communicate.
Yeah.
It's like we have these unspoken rules, these assumptions about how people should interact, how they should express themselves.
Right, and those rules aren't universal.
Exactly. And that's where a lot of misunderstandings can happen, especially in a globalized world where we're interacting with people from all different cultures.
It's like that classic example, right? Some cultures are very direct, others are more subtle.
Right. And what might be considered polite in one culture could be seen as rude in another.
So it's not just about the words we use.
No.
It's about body language, tone of voice, all those subtle cues.
It's about understanding the context, the cultural norms.
It's like you have to learn a whole new set of rules.
In a way, yes. And that's why cross-cultural communication, it's a skill. It's something you have to practice and develop.
Like learning a new language almost.
Exactly. And just like with language learning, the more you immerse yourself,
Right.
the more you interact with people from different cultures.
The better you get at it.
Exactly. You start to pick up on the nuances, the unspoken rules.
You become more attuned to those subtle differences.
And that's when you can really start to build those strong, meaningful connections with people from all over the world.
which ultimately is what it's all about, right? Whether you're
Yeah,
talking about sales or just life in general.
absolutely. It's about connection. It's about understanding. It's about building bridges across cultures.
I like that. Building bridges, not walls.
Exactly. And on that note, I think it's time for us to take a short break. When we come back, we'll continue this conversation and explore some practical tips for navigating the complexities of cross-cultural communication. All right, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? From sales strategies to language learning and even touched on the kind of the bigger picture of like cross-cultural communication.
Yeah, it's been a really fascinating journey. I mean, who knew an English training podcast could spark so many different ideas?
Right. And it just goes to show, I think, that communication is so multifaceted.
Yeah.
It's not just about the words we use.
Right.
It's about building relationships, understanding different perspectives, and really trying to connect with people, on a deeper level.
And I think that's a key takeaway for me from this whole deep dive. It's like we started talking about driving sales, but what we've really been exploring is how to drive connection.
I love that. Yeah, it's about building bridges, not walls.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess the question now is, what are some practical things people can do to become better communicators, especially in today's world where we're constantly interacting with people from different cultures?
Well, I think first and foremost, it starts with a mindset shift.
Okay.
We have to be willing to step outside of our own assumptions, our own cultural bubbles.
So it's about being more open-minded.
Exactly, and curious. Instead of assuming everyone thinks the same way we do, we need to ask questions, listen actively, and really try to understand where other people are coming from.
So like that old saying, seek first to understand, then to be understood.
Exactly, and it's not just about the words.
Yeah.
It's about paying attention to nonverbal cues, tone of voice, all of that.
It's like reading between the lines.
Exactly, and it takes practice. It's a skill, just like learning a new language. The more you do it, the better you get at it.
And the more comfortable you become with those like subtle differences.
Right, and that's when the real magic happens, I think. When you can connect with someone on a deeper level, despite those differences, that's when you can really build something special.
It's like instead of just trying to match the competitors, you're trying to understand them, collaborate with them.
Exactly, and that's a much more sustainable approach in the long run.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay.
Communication is a powerful tool, but like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad. So let's all try to use it wisely, with intention, and with respect for everyone we interact with.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And on that note, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Until next time.
All right, welcome in everybody to another deep dive. And today we're going to be looking at something pretty cool. I think we're going to be cracking open a business English podcast episode.
Okay.
That's all about sales strategies.
Interesting.
Now, this is targeted
Mm.
at English language learners,
Okay.
but stick with us.
Right.
Even if you were fluent in English,
Hmm.
I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff to pull out of this.
Yeah, I was going to say, even if you're already pretty good at English, there are still some sneaky good insights we can get about communication, like in the workplace and also
Absolutely.
dynamics between people.
Yeah, and maybe we can analyze some of that corporate culture that we all
Yes.
love to pick apart.
That's what I was thinking too when I was listening to this. What I found fascinating was how this seemingly like basic language lesson gives us a peek behind the curtain of sales and all the little ways that teams try to kind of manage those high pressure situations.
Right, so
Yeah.
let's set the scene a little bit. The podcast episode we're going to be looking at features a dialogue between a sales team
Uh-huh.
and their boss,
Okay.
who,
Yeah.
let's just say, maybe not winning any
Shit.
Manager of the Year awards anytime soon.
No, not really. He throws us right into some of the most common management tropes, but we can talk about that later.
Yeah.
First, I think we should unpack some of the key phrases that they use. The team in this episode is tasked with figuring out how to drive sales, which is a term you hear all the time in the business world, but is often taken for granted, I think.
Yeah, it's one of those things you hear and you're like, oh yeah, okay, sure.
Yeah.
Increase sales. I got it. But is there a little bit more to it than that?
Yeah, definitely. Drive sales means you're taking a more proactive, even kind of forceful approach. It's not about waiting for the customer to come to you. You have to go out and like actively look for those opportunities, figure out some good strategies, and yeah, sometimes even push a little bit to reach those targets.
So it's not
Just
just about selling, it's also about steering the whole sales
different parts of the sales
process. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so Another phrase that I heard them using was match the competitors.
Oh, yeah.
Again, that sounds pretty straightforward on the surface, like keep up with the Joneses.
Right.
Is there more to it?
So matching your competitors in this context isn't just about equaling them. It's about looking at what they're good at, what they're not good at, figuring out how to kind of get the upper hand, and basically trying to do better than them.
Okay.
This could mean a bunch of different things, like having better prices than them, coming up with new and better products, or giving better customer service than they are.
So it's like a constant game of chess.
Exactly.
We're always thinking about what your opponent's going to do
Yeah, you have to be one step ahead.
and planning your own strategy.
That kind of strategic thinking is super important, especially nowadays when there's so much competition in the market. Companies can't just sit around and wait for things to happen. They have to be ahead of the game and come up with new ideas if they want to stay on top.
Okay. And speaking of proactive,
Hmm.
our sales team in the podcast is definitely trying.
Yeah,
They're throwing ideas out left and right, but their boss
They are.
just seems to shoot them down immediately.
Right, he's not into it.
One phrase that he kept using was, "It'll never fly."
Oh, yeah, that's a classic. It'll never fly. It's informal, but it definitely gets the message across that he does not like the idea. And, it can be really discouraging for a team when they're just trying to brainstorm.
Right.
It's interesting, though, because even though the phrase is pretty informal, you actually hear it used in professional settings a lot, particularly when people are under pressure to make quick decisions.
So it's like a power move almost.
Yes, exactly.
Just shutting down the idea before it even has a chance to get off the ground.
Right. And this brings us to Mr. Swan, the boss, in this episode.
Oh, boy.
He is a perfect example of what not to do when you're a leader. He's impatient, he's always criticizing people, and he seems more interested in being in control than actually working together with his team.
Yeah, I have to admit, listening to him, I was cringing a little bit.
Really?
Just the way that he would shoot down
Yeah.
every idea. Bad idea. Really bad idea.
Just terrible.
Not exactly inspiring leadership.
No.
The kind of stuff you read
But
about
you wouldn't find this guy in a best places to work article.
in those best places to work articles, right?
Right. But, maybe we should think about the bigger picture here. It could be that Mr. Swan is under a lot of pressure to get results, and that's why he's acting the way he is. Or maybe this particular industry just requires people to be more assertive and make decisions faster.
That's a good point.
Whew.
I think it's easy to label him as just a bad boss without thinking about the whole situation.
Right. And even though the way he talks to his team is not great,
Yeah.
he does have a point when he says that he wants to see concrete solutions. At the end of the day, you need to have a plan that you can actually put into action, not just vague ideas.
So there's something to be learned even from a bad boss.
Exactly. It's about finding those little nuggets of wisdom, even when someone isn't behaving the way they should.
Okay, so before we go too far down the rabbit hole of analyzing Mr. Swan's management style,
Okay.
there's another phrase that I wanted to mention.
Yeah, what is it?
The team uses the term "in the market" when they're talking about their product.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's a common phrase, but I think we sometimes forget how much it actually implies.
Right. In the market might seem simple, but it really shows that a company knows what's going on around them. It means they understand the industry, who the major players are, and the overall trends. It's not just about existing, it's about knowing where you fit in the whole scheme of things.
It's like they're saying, we know who we're up against and we're ready to compete.
Exactly. And that kind of awareness is essential for any business, big or small, no matter what industry they're in.
Okay, so now before we move on and really break down the rest of this conversation, there's one more thing I wanted to point out from the podcast episode.
Oh.
They have this segment called Fluency Builder, which is designed to help people who are learning English to express themselves better.
Yeah.
But honestly, I think these tips are useful for native speakers too.
I agree. They offer some really good insights into how powerful our word choices can be and how even small changes in the way we say things can have a big impact on how our message comes across.
For example,
Yeah.
instead of saying, "I'll be there soon," they suggest saying, "I'll be there any minute."
Oh, yeah.
It's a small change, but it makes it sound more urgent and specific.
Right. And that kind of precision is super important when you're communicating in a professional setting. It helps avoid confusion and make sure that everybody's on the same page.
Yeah, it's like the difference between sending a vague text message and actually scheduling a specific time to meet.
Exactly.
One is open to interpretation. The other one shows that you're serious and committed.
Right. And being committed to being clear is what makes a good communicator. It's about respecting other people's time and making sure that they understand exactly what you mean.
So even in a podcast that's designed for language learners,
Mm-hmm.
we can find some really good lessons about communication that go beyond just the language itself. It's all about being clear, concise, and making an impact.
Absolutely. Yeah, it really is amazing how even something as simple as a language lesson can get us thinking about how we communicate in general.
Yeah, it's like we found this secret path that leads us from basic vocabulary to these big ideas about how the words we choose actually shape how we see things and interact with each other.
And speaking of interactions, let's go back to that brainstorming session in the podcast.
Okay.
Remember how the team was trying to figure out what to do about their product being the most expensive in the market? Which, as you mentioned before, is a pretty loaded phrase.
Yeah, it's not just about being out there. It's about knowing where you stand and what kind of value you offer to customers.
Exactly.
But it seemed like their boss wasn't really interested in having a deep conversation about market positioning.
Yeah, he was more interested
They just wanted
to
to
fix fixes.
a quick solution.
Yeah, so this is where the whole idea of short-term solutions versus long-term strategies comes into play. The team suggests doing a 2-for-1 promotion, which is a pretty classic way to get people to buy things and make them feel like they're getting a good deal.
Oh, yeah, that's super common.
You see it everywhere, right?
Yeah, all the time.
But Mr. Swan just shuts it down immediately.
Right.
It's the same thing as just lowering the price.
Yeah.
His reaction, while kind of rude, does bring up a good point, though. Promotions can affect how much profit you make,
Okay.
but I think it's a little too simplistic to say that a 2-for-1 deal is exactly the same as just making the product cheaper.
Right, because a promotion could be a way to deal with people who are worried about the price without actually making your product seem less valuable.
Exactly. It's all about how you present it. Instead of saying, our product is cheaper now, you're saying you get more for your money.
Right. It's like
Yeah.
saying, we didn't lower the quality, we just gave you more stuff.
Exactly. And that small change in how you say things can make a big difference in how people see the offer.
This actually reminds me of something we were talking about earlier,
What's that?
about how important it is to choose the right words. Remember in the Fluency Builder part of the podcast, they had some great examples of how even changing just one or two words can make you sound more clear and professional.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. One tip that I really liked was using the word consider instead of think about when you're talking about different strategies.
Okay.
It makes you sound more formal and like you're really putting some thought into it.
It's subtle, but it's effective.
Yeah, it's like the difference between just tossing ideas around and presenting a plan that you've actually put some work into.
I like that.
And they also talked about using strong verbs, which is something I think we all forget to do sometimes.
Yeah, it's easy to slip into passive language without even noticing.
Totally.
Yeah.
So instead of saying, we're thinking about a sales strategy, they say, we are developing a sales strategy.
Oh, I see.
It makes it sound like you're actually doing something and making progress.
Right, like you're not just dreaming about it. You're actually
Mhm.
taking steps to make it happen.
Exactly. It changes the whole feeling of the sentence.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about how people communicate and about different leadership styles.
Mm-hmm.
But there's another aspect to all of this that I find really interesting.
What's that?
It's the whole idea of perspective. Remember how the boss was so quick to dismiss all of the team's ideas?
Yeah.
But then when his colleague, Mr. Swan, presented the exact same idea,
Yeah.
he was all for it.
I know. It's funny how that works, right?
It just shows how our biases and preconceived notions can really affect our judgment.
Totally. We're more likely to accept ideas when they come from people we see as authority figures or people who think like us.
It's a good reminder that even in a field like business where things are supposed to be objective, human psychology plays a big role.
Definitely. And that's why it's so important to be open-minded and curious, to question your own assumptions and to be willing to consider different points of view, even if they seem weird or challenging at first.
It's about recognizing that good ideas can come from anywhere, and that if you reject an idea just because of who said it, you're missing out on opportunities to grow and innovate.
Exactly. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels comfortable sharing their thoughts and ideas no matter what their position or title is.
And speaking of inclusivity,
Yeah.
there was another cultural observation in the podcast that I thought was really fascinating.
Oh, what's that?
It was the way they used the word brilliant.
Oh, yeah. Brilliant is a very British thing.
Okay.
They use it to show that they really like something or that they're impressed.
Okay.
It's like saying, this is amazing. I'm really impressed.
So it's more than just saying good or great.
Yeah, it has a lot more enthusiasm behind it. It's interesting how one word can reflect these cultural differences and how people express themselves. Like
Yeah.
brilliant Might sound a little over the top in some situations, but in others, it's totally normal and expected.
It reminds us that good communication isn't just about choosing the right words. It's about understanding all the little nuances of language and how those nuances are perceived in different cultures and settings.
Exactly. And that awareness is super important, especially in today's world, where we're all connected and interacting with people from all over the place.
Okay, so as we move into the final part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
I want to leave our listeners with a question.
Okay.
And it's a question that I think we should all ask ourselves too.
All right, I'm listening.
How can we take all of these insights about communication, leadership, and perspective and apply them to our own lives?
That's a good question. How can we be more aware of the language we use, be more open to different points of view, and be better at getting our message across?
And how can we create environments where brilliance can really shine no matter who's sharing the idea?
Yeah. It's like we've been handed this incredible toolkit to help us unlock those light bulb moments, not just in the business world, but in any situation where clear communication is important.
Ah,
And what's really fascinating to me is that we started with this simple business English podcast, and as we've dug deeper, we've gone way beyond just vocabulary.
yeah.
We've uncovered these insights about strategic thinking leadership and even the subtle ways that cultural differences can shape how we understand things.
We started by breaking down phrases like drive sales and match the competitors, and we realized that those aren't just empty business buzzwords. They actually point to these deeper strategic approaches.
Right, and even though our bad boss, Mr. Swan, wasn't exactly a role model, he did accidentally highlight how important it is to be clear and have concrete solutions, especially in a fast-paced environment.
Though I do have to say, his communication skills could have used a little work.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder if maybe those fluency builder tips could have helped him get his point across better, and maybe even reduce some of that tension with his team.
Maybe, yeah. Those tips might seem basic, but they're good reminders about how much power our words have. Using strong verbs, cutting out filler words, and paying attention to your tone can make a big difference in how you communicate.
It's like the difference between stumbling through a presentation and delivering it with confidence.
Exactly.
One leaves the audience confused and unsure, the other one motivates them to take action.
And that ability to inspire action is super important, whether you're leading a team, pitching an idea, or even just trying to get your point across in a meeting.
But it's not just about being persuasive, right?
You know?
It's also about being open to what other people have to say.
Yeah.
Remember how the boss completely shut down the team's ideas, but then he loved the same idea when his colleague Mr. Swan suggested it?
Oh, yeah, that was classic.
It's a powerful reminder of how easily our biases can affect our judgment, even when we don't realize it.
Totally. We have to work on having a curious and open mind, actively looking for different perspectives and questioning our own assumptions.
Because those innovative ideas can come from anywhere.
Absolutely.
And that brings us back to the question we asked earlier.
Okay.
How can we use all of these insights to improve our own lives? How can we become better communicators, more thoughtful leaders, and more receptive to those brilliant ideas that might be right in front of us?
I think it starts with a simple shift in perspective.
Okay.
The next time you're in a meeting, really try to listen for those subtle cues in how people are talking and the unspoken dynamics between them.
And remember, even those bad boss situations can teach us something. Figure out why certain communication styles work or don't work, and think about how you would handle those situations differently.
Don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions and seek out different points of view, even the ones that make you feel a little uncomfortable.
And most importantly, hold on to that curiosity that led us down this rabbit hole in the first place.
Yeah.
I mean, who would have thought that a business English podcast could lead to such an interesting conversation about communication leadership and the power of perspective?
It just goes to show that there are learning opportunities everywhere if we're willing to look for them.
So keep those ears open and those minds engaged,
Yeah.
and don't be afraid to explore even those seemingly boring corners of knowledge.
You never know what you might find.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Until next time, keep those conversations flowing and keep searching for those brilliant moments of insight.